In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, where wrought iron balconies cast shadows across narrow cobblestone streets, stands a mansion that has haunted the American imagination for nearly 2 centuries. At 1140 Royal Street, on the corner of Governor Nichols Street, an elegant 3-story structure rises above its neighbors, its pale facade hiding secrets so horrific they would eventually transform it into one of the most infamous addresses in the United States. This is the story of the LaLaurie Mansion, a place where wealth and refinement concealed unspeakable cruelty, where the screams of the tortured went unheard behind closed doors, and where the past refuses to rest. The woman, who would become synonymous with this house of horrors, was born Madame Delphine LaLaurie on March 19, 1787, into one of New Orleans' most prominent families. Her father, Louis Barthélemy McCarty, held the prestigious title of Chevalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. Her mother, Marie-Jeanne L'Érable, was known throughout the city for throwing extravagant parties that lasted until dawn. The McCarty family owned over 1,300 acres of land and moved in the highest circles of Creole society. Young Delphine's cousin, Augustin de McCarty, would later serve as mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. But Delphine's childhood was not without darkness. She was only 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, sending shockwaves through slave-owning families across the American South and Caribbean. Her own uncle had been killed 20 years earlier by the people he enslaved, a tragedy that would echo through generations of the McCarty family. The revolution inspired further uprisings and created a culture of increased brutality toward enslaved people, as owners grew paranoid about resistance and rebellion. At barely 14 years old, Delphine entered into her first marriage with Don Ramón de López y Angulo, a Spanish official more than twice her age. Ramón held a powerful position as second-in-command to the Louisiana governor and was appointed Consul General of Spain shortly after their marriage. This union elevated young Delphine to one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold in New Orleans at that time. But tragedy struck in 1804 when Ramón died mysteriously while traveling back to Spain. Some historians claim he was being promoted to a prominent position at the Spanish court. Others suggest it was military punishment, that he was being recalled and barred from his territory in New Orleans. The true circumstances of his death remain unclear to this day. 4 years later, in June 1808, the widowed Delphine married Jean Blanc, a wealthy and well-connected figure in New Orleans society. Blanqui was a merchant, lawyer, banker, and state legislator, but he was also involved in darker enterprises. He worked as a slave trader and smuggler, maintaining close associations with the notorious pirates Jean and Pierre Lafitte. The marriage produced 4 children, but it would end in financial disaster. When Blanqui died in 1815 at the age of 50, he left Delphine with debts totaling over $2.5 million in today's money. To protect her personal property and assets, Delphine was forced to renounce their community property to the court and forfeit all mutual assets. She would spend the next 10 years struggling to pay off his enormous debts. Fortune smiled on Delphine once more when her father passed away in 1824, leaving her a substantial inheritance. With her finances restored, she began to rebuild her social standing. The following year, at a chiropractor appointment of all places, she met the man who would become her third husband. Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie had recently arrived from France after graduating from medical school. He was 20 years younger than Delphine, handsome and ambitious. They married in 1825, with Delphine giving birth to a son 5 months before the wedding ceremony. His marriage appeared successful at first. In 1832, Delphine commissioned the construction of a grand mansion on Royal Street. The 3-story neoclassical structure was designed to showcase her restored wealth and social position. The mansion featured elegant arched doorways, intricate ironwork, spacious courtyards, and luxurious furnishings including pianos, armoires, and expensive buffets. Delphine and Dr. LaLaurie moved into this impressive residence with two of her daughters and maintained slave quarters on the property, as was customary for wealthy New Orleans families of that era. Delphine quickly re-established herself as one of the city's most celebrated hostesses. She threw lavish dinner parties that attracted the cream of New Orleans society. She served expensive wines and employed a full staff of enslaved people to cater to her guests' every need. Those who attended these gatherings described her as charming, graceful, and sophisticated. She appeared to be the very picture of Southern refinement and hospitality. Beneath this polished exterior, something sinister was taking root. Neighbors began to notice troubling signs. They reported hearing loud arguments between Delphine and her husband echoing through the mansion at all hours. The couple's incompatibility became increasingly obvious, and they lived apart much of the time. Some accounts suggest that Dr. LaLaurie retreated to Plaquemines Parish to escape his wife's volatile temper. The neighbors also noticed that the enslaved people at the LaLaurie residence appeared unusually gaunt and miserable compared to others in the neighborhood. British philosopher Harriet Martineau visited New Orleans in 1836 and later documented what residents had told her about the LaLaurie household. She wrote that the enslaved people there were extremely emaciated and unhappy. Yet in public appearances, Madame LaLaurie presented herself as polite to African Americans and concerned about the welfare of her slaves. She would even hand half-empty wine glasses to the enslaved person waiting behind her chair during dinner parties, insisting they drink it. Her coachman was reportedly fed to sleekness. This stark contrast between her public persona and private actions would become one of the most disturbing aspects of her story. In 1828, Madame LaLaurie was officially investigated for cruelty toward enslaved people. Although the court records from this investigation have been lost, documentation shows that she paid for legal services and sold several enslaved people following the inquiry. But she was not deterred. She continued to acquire and torment those under her control. Funeral records from New Orleans between 1830 and 1834 document 12 deaths of enslaved people at the LaLaurie residence. The causes of death were never mentioned in these records, an omission that has sinister implications. Among the dead were a woman named Bonne, who worked as the cook and laundress, along with her 4 children ranging from 13 years old down to just 4. The fact that entire families were dying within the mansion's walls should have raised alarms. But in a society where enslaved people were considered property, their deaths attracted little official attention. One incident did cause a significant stir. In 1833, a young enslaved girl reportedly fell to her death from the mansion's roof. The girl's name was Leah, and witnesses claimed they saw Madame LaLaurie chasing her through the house with a whip, her face twisted with rage. According to the accounts, Leah had accidentally hit a snag while brushing Delphine's hair, causing her mistress pain. Enraged, Delphine grabbed a whip and pursued the terrified child through the mansion, until Leah, seeing no escape, leaped from the balcony to her death. Her body was buried in a shallow grave behind the mansion. His time, the authorities could not ignore what had happened. An investigation was launched, and Madame LaLaurie was found guilty of cruelly abusing her enslaved people. As punishment, she was forced to forfeit her 9 remaining bondspeople. They were taken away and scheduled to be sold at public auction. But Delphine had connections and resources. She persuaded a relative to purchase the enslaved people at auction and then secretly return them to her custody. Within a short time, all 9 were back under her control, and whatever was happening behind the mansion's closed doors continued unchecked. Early 1834, Dr. LaLaurie had officially moved out of the mansion. The marriage had completely collapsed. Some historians believe that being abandoned by her much younger husband pushed the already unstable Delphine over the edge. She still had dominion over her human property, and one can only imagine her jealousy, rage, and feelings of insecurity manifesting as increased cruelty toward those who had no power to resist or escape. Thus, morning of April 10th, 1834, began like any other in the French Quarter. Then, around noon, smoke began to pour from the LaLaurie Mansion. A fire had broken out in the kitchen, and flames were quickly spreading through the building. Neighbors rushed to help, and a crowd began to gather on Royal Street. But when people tried to enter the burning structure to rescue anyone trapped inside, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The LaLauries refused to provide the keys to the slave quarters and responded to requests in what newspaper accounts described as a gross and insulting manner. The crowd grew increasingly agitated. Finally, a group of men forced their way past the LaLauries and broke down the doors to the slave quarters. What they found would haunt New Orleans for generations to come. In the kitchen, they discovered a 70-year-old enslaved woman chained to the stove by her ankle. She confessed that she had deliberately started the fire as a suicide attempt. She told the rescuers that enslaved people taken to the upper floor of the LaLaurie home never returned, and she preferred to die in flames rather than face whatever fate awaited her there. Fifth, men demanded access to the upper floors. When the LaLauries continued to refuse, they broke through more doors and climbed the stairs to the attic. The moment they opened that final door, they were overwhelmed by the stench of death, decay, and human suffering. According to the New Orleans Bee newspaper, published the following day, they discovered 7 enslaved people, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. The newspaper reported that the victims had been kept barely alive to prolong their suffering, and to make them taste all that the most refined cruelty could inflict. Our accounts from witnesses describe scenes of almost unimaginable horror. The enslaved people were emaciated, their bodies bearing the marks of repeated beatings and torture. Some wore spiked iron collars that kept their heads locked in one position. Others had been bound in restrictive postures for so long that their limbs were permanently damaged. One man had a hole in his skull with maggots crawling through his exposed brain. The conditions suggested that these atrocities had been ongoing for months or even years. The rescued individuals were immediately taken to the local jail for medical attention and protection. Word of what had been discovered spread through New Orleans like wildfire. Over the next several days, more than 4,000 people came to see the survivors with their own eyes. The city's French-language newspaper, The Bee, published detailed accounts that condemned what they called the barbarous and fiendish atrocities committed by the woman LaLaurie upon the persons of her slaves. The newspaper went so far as to call her a demon in the shape of a woman. Public outrage reached a boiling point. An angry mob descended upon the LaLaurie Mansion, determined to exact justice. But Madame LaLaurie had one final card to play. Among all the people she had tortured and terrorized, she had one loyal servant, her coachman. As the mob gathered outside, he brought her carriage to the front of the burning house. With complete confidence and utter disregard for the fury surrounding her, Delphine LaLaurie stepped into the carriage and ordered him to drive. The crowd attempted to stop her departure, but the coachman successfully fought through, delivering his mistress to the docks at Lake Pontchartrain where a ship was waiting. Delphine boarded that vessel and fled New Orleans forever. When the faithful coachman returned to the mansion, the mob turned their fury on him. They destroyed the carriage before killing the horses that had carried Delphine to safety. Then they ransacked the mansion itself, destroying furniture, smashing windows, and demolishing what the fire had not already consumed. The elegant home that had been the site of so many glittering parties was left a shattered ruin. If you're fascinated by stories like this, stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you thoroughly researched documentaries that explore the mysteries, horrors, and forgotten tales that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more chilling stories from the shadows of the past. Madame LaLaurie's fate, after fleeing New Orleans, remains somewhat mysterious. Most accounts suggest she traveled first to Mobile, Alabama, then to New York, before eventually settling in Paris. American poet William Cullen Bryant wrote in his published journal that he had seen her in those cities during her flight. In Paris, Delphine and her children rented lodgings in a fashionable neighborhood near the Church of La Madeleine and made frequent visits to health spas in the Pyrenees Mountains. She continued to live in the style to which she was accustomed, borrowing heavily at exorbitant interest rates to support her lavish lifestyle. Official records in Paris indicate that Delphine LaLaurie died on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. However, another story persists in New Orleans. In the late 1930s, Eugene Bax, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, discovered an old cracked copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery. The inscription read, Madame LaLaurie, née Marie Delphine Macati, deceased in Paris, the 7th of December, 1842, at the age of 6. The date was different from the Paris records, and some believe this proves that her body was secretly returned to New Orleans and buried in her home city. To this day, tourists visit what they believe may be her grave, though the truth of her final resting place remains debated. 2 of the enslaved people rescued from the LaLaurie Mansion died from their injuries within weeks of being freed. 2 more bodies were later found buried on the mansion grounds, including that of little Leah, the girl who had jumped to her death the previous year. The exact number of people who died under Delphine LaLaurie's roof may never be known. Some estimates suggest as many as 57 victims, though this number cannot be verified through historical records. After the scandal, the ruined mansion stood empty for several years, a grim reminder of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. In 1838, the property was rebuilt and began its long, strange afterlife. Over the following decades, it would be transformed multiple times, serving as a conservatory of music, a refuge for young delinquents, an apartment complex, a furniture store, and a private school for young girls. Each incarnation seemed to be short-lived, and each came with its own disturbing stories. When the building was converted into an all-girls school in the mid-19th century, students and teachers reported bizarre occurrences. Young women claimed to be physically assaulted by invisible forces. They felt hands pushing them, experienced unexplained scratches and bruises, and heard screams echoing through the halls when no one else was present. The school eventually closed, unable to keep students or staff willing to remain in the building. When it served as an apartment complex, tenants reported a heavy, oppressive atmosphere in certain areas of the building. They heard chains rattling, footsteps on empty staircases, and moaning that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. One tenant was murdered under circumstances so unusual that locals attributed his death to paranormal causes rather than human agency. Residents would move in full of hope and move out weeks later, pale and shaken, refusing to speak about what they had experienced. In the 1990s, the property management company brought in parapsychologist Christopher Chacon to conduct a scientific assessment of the reported phenomena. Chacon spent several months investigating the building and documented countless instances of what he classified as genuine paranormal activity. He recorded unexplained temperature drops, electromagnetic anomalies, and what he believed to be genuine spirit manifestations. His findings only added to the mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. Ghost tour guides working in the French Quarter have their own experiences to share. One guide reported feeling a sharp tug on her messenger bag while standing outside the mansion in the middle of telling the LaLaurie story to her tour group. She spun around expecting to find a pickpocket, but no one was there. Moments later, she felt an even harder yank on the bag. This happened repeatedly until she moved her group away from the building. Other guides report feeling watched while near the property, experiencing sudden chills even on warm New Orleans nights, and seeing fleeting shadows in the mansion's upper windows. Visitors to the French Quarter often report seeing apparitions in the building's windows, particularly on the third floor, where the attic chamber of horrors was discovered. People describe seeing the figure of a young girl standing on the roof or in the courtyard, believed to be the ghost of Leah, still trying to escape her tormentor. Others claim to hear screams and cries for help emanating from the building in the dead of night, sounds that seem to come from another time. The mansion has changed hands numerous times over the decades, and there's a persistent belief that anyone who owns or lives in the property experiences misfortune. In 2007, actor Nicolas Cage purchased the mansion for $3.45 million, perhaps drawn by its dark history, or seeing it as an investment in one of New Orleans' most famous landmarks. But Cage never lived in the property. By 2009, he had declared bankruptcy and lost the mansion to foreclosure. Some New Orleans residents whispered that it was the curse of the LaLaurie Mansion that caused his financial downfall, though his well-documented financial problems extended far beyond this single property. The mansion was most recently owned by Houston-based energy trader Michael Whalen, before being listed for sale in 2024 for $10.25 million. Real estate listing photos show a beautiful estate with colorful rooms adorned with antique furniture and modern touches, but many people who see these images cannot help but wonder how anyone could live in a place with such a horrific past. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion remains a private residence, closed to public tours. You can only view it from the street, where it stands as a silent sentinel at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols. It's a frequent stop on New Orleans ghost tours, where guides recount the terrible history that unfolded behind those elegant walls. The building itself is an architectural masterpiece, an example of federal-style design with its grand scale, ornate ironwork, and classic proportions. But no amount of beauty can erase what happened there. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion raises difficult questions about memory, tourism, and how we engage with the darkest chapters of American history. Historian Tia Miles has written extensively about what she calls dark tourism, the way places like the LaLaurie Mansion become entertainment rather than sites of somber reflection. She argues that the focus on ghost stories and hauntings can sometimes overshadow the real human tragedy that occurred, the lives of enslaved people who suffered and died there. These were real human beings with names, families, dreams, and hopes, not just plot points in a scary story. Bon and her 4 children, Leah, who was just 12 years old, the 70-year-old woman chained to the kitchen stove who chose death by fire over continued torture, the 7 people found mutilated in the attic. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who endured unimaginable cruelty. At the same time, there's value in preserving and sharing this history, however painful it may be. The LaLaurie Mansion stands as a stark reminder of the horrors of slavery, of how evil could flourish behind closed doors in a society that treated human beings as property. It reminds us that the people we celebrate, the wealthy and powerful, who throw elegant parties and move in elite social circles, may harbor terrible secrets. It warns us that cruelty thrives in silence, that atrocities occur when communities fail to protect their most vulnerable members. His story also reveals the limitations of the justice system in antebellum New Orleans. Despite multiple investigations, despite the testimony of neighbors, despite the death of a child, Madame LaLaurie was never truly held accountable for her crimes. She was briefly forced to forfeit her enslaved people, only to acquire them back through a legal loophole. When her atrocities were finally exposed, she simply fled to live out her days in comfort in Paris. The enslaved people had no advocates powerful enough to bring her to justice, no legal standing to testify against her, no protection under a system that viewed them as property rather than people. There's also historical debate about exactly how much of the LaLaurie story is fact versus sensationalized legend. The New Orleans Bee. The newspaper that published the most detailed and gruesome accounts of what was found in the mansion had a reputation at the time similar to a tabloid. Some historians argue that the descriptions of medical experiments and bizarre mutilations may have been exaggerated or even invented by the newspaper's rival faction in the city's cultural and political wars. In the 1830s, New Orleans was experiencing tension between the French Creole society and the growing American population, and some suggest the Bee's coverage was partly aimed at damaging the reputation of a prominent Creole family. In 1934, historian Meigs Frost published an article suggesting that much of the story was the result of a smear campaign orchestrated by Monsieur Montreul, a spurned neighbor of Madame LaLaurie. Frost claimed that Delphine's indulgence of her slaves was well documented by friends, that she handed them wine glasses from her own table and kept her coachman well fed. He even suggested that Leah's death was an accident, that the child was sliding down a curving banister while playing and fell, killed by the marble hallway floor rather than by jumping from the roof. However, several factors argue against this revisionist view. Multiple independent sources, including the British philosopher Harriet Martineau, who had no stake in local politics, documented concerns about the treatment of the LaLaurie slaves. The funeral records showing 12 deaths in 4 years are official documents, not newspaper accounts. The legal proceedings following the investigation into Leah's death are a matter of record, and most tellingly, dozens of witnesses saw the condition of the enslaved people rescued from the fire, people who were so clearly abused that over 4,000 New Orleans residents came to see them. 2 died from their injuries within weeks. Whatever the exact details of what happened in that attic, something terrible clearly occurred. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere between the most extreme accounts and the complete denials. Delphine LaLaurie was a product of her time and place, raised in a society built on the enslavement and dehumanization of African people. But even by the standards of that brutal era, her treatment of enslaved people was considered shocking and criminal. The investigation of 1828, the guilty verdict in 1833, the horrified reaction of her neighbors, and the New Orleans community all indicate that what she did went far beyond what was socially acceptable, even in a slave-owning society. Some historians have attempted to understand what drove Madame LaLaurie to such extremes of cruelty. Was she mentally ill, suffering from what we might today recognize as severe personality disorders or psychopathic tendencies? Was she driven mad by the humiliation of her failed third marriage to a younger man who eventually abandoned her? Did childhood trauma from learning about her uncle's death and the Haitian Revolution create a pathological fear and hatred of enslaved people? Did she derive some twisted satisfaction from exerting absolute power over those who could not fight back? We will never have definitive answers to these questions. What we know is that Delphine LaLaurie had the wealth, social position, and legal protections to indulge her worst impulses without consequence for years. We know that a society structured around slavery created conditions where such abuses could occur behind closed doors. We know that the victims were real people who suffered real torment and death, and we know that the legacy of that suffering still lingers in the French Quarter, felt by those who stand outside the mansion's walls and sense the weight of its terrible history. The LaLaurie Mansion has become more than just a building. It's a symbol, a cautionary tale, a ghost story, and a historical landmark all rolled into one. It has appeared in numerous books, television shows, and films. American Horror Story featured the house, and Madame LaLaurie, played by Kathy Bates, prominently in its 3rd season. though they filmed the scenes at the nearby Gallia house rather than the actual LaLaurie Mansion. The show's depiction was heavily fictionalized, adding supernatural elements and taking liberties with the historical record, but it introduced the story to millions of viewers who might never have heard of it otherwise. The Mansion continues to capture imaginations and inspire discussions about how we remember and interpret difficult history. Some argue that the focus on hauntings and ghost stories trivializes the real suffering that occurred and turns tragedy into entertainment. Others contend that the supernatural elements, whether real or imagined, help keep the story alive and ensure that people continue to grapple with this dark chapter of the past. Perhaps both perspectives have merit. As you stand on Royal Street today and look up at the LaLaurie Mansion, you see a beautiful building that has survived fire, riots, hurricanes, and nearly 200 years of history. You see intricate ironwork balconies, tall windows, and elegant proportions. But if you know the story, you also see something else. You see a place where human cruelty reached depths that still shock us nearly 2 centuries later. You see a reminder that evil can wear a beautiful face, that monsters can move in polite society, that atrocities can happen in plain sight when communities turn a blind eye. The enslaved people who suffered and died in that house deserved better. They deserved justice, freedom, and the chance to live their lives in peace. They deserved to be more than ghosts in someone else's horror story. By remembering their names when we can, by acknowledging the reality of what was done to them, by refusing to sanitize or romanticize the brutality of slavery, we honor their memory in some small way. The LaLaurie Mansion stands as a monument to one of the darkest aspects of American history. It reminds us that the fight for human rights and dignity is never finished, that we must remain vigilant against cruelty and oppression in all their forms. It challenges us to look honestly at our past, no matter how uncomfortable that examination may be. And it warns us that the ghosts of history, whether literal or metaphorical, will continue to haunt us until we truly reckon with the sins of our ancestors. If you found this documentary compelling and want to explore more hidden and haunting stories from American history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you thoroughly researched, thoughtfully presented explorations of the mysteries, crimes, and forgotten chapters that shaped our world. Join our community of history enthusiasts by hitting that subscribe button now. The past has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them together.